There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over an emergency room waiting area at 2 in the morning when a phone buzzes on a stranger's armrest and the stranger is too exhausted to notice it. I sat quietly in that stillness on a Tuesday night in Columbus, Ohio, holding my estranged husband's own phone in my hand. I was reading, slowly, a private note he had written entirely to himself, one he never once intended for me to see. My name is Annalise Kovacs. I am 44 years old. For the last 9 years, I have owned and personally operated a small bakery on the north side of Columbus. Let me take you back to the specific phone call that finally broke 7 long years of silence, and to the quiet note that eventually explained exactly why he had finally made it. I first met Garrison Brennan when I was 26, working as a pastry assistant at a hotel restaurant downtown, and he was finishing a graduate degree in urban planning 2 blocks away. We eventually married 2 years later, in a small ceremony neither of our own families could really afford. For a good while, our life together looked exactly like the ordinary life I had always assumed I would eventually have. We had our only son, Reese, exactly 3 years into the marriage. Everything that came after his own birth changed the entire shape of our lives, more than either of us truly expected, though not in the way either of us honestly hoped. Garrison had proposed to me at a small Italian restaurant downtown, nervous in a way I had never seen him before. I remember thinking, driving home that night, that I had found someone who would take care of me if anything ever genuinely went wrong. I held onto that memory for a long time afterward, even once it stopped matching the man I actually lived with. I nearly died delivering Reese, from a hemorrhage the doctors did not fully control for almost an hour, and I spent 4 days afterward in a hospital bed, more frightened than I had ever been in my life. The physical recovery took months. What came after the physical recovery, though, was harder to explain to anyone. A persistent, grinding panic arrived without warning, in grocery stores, at red lights, during ordinary conversations, a fear so specific and physical that I sometimes could not breathe through it. I told Garrison, as plainly as I could manage, that something was genuinely wrong, that I needed real help beyond simply resting more. Garrison did not believe me, not in the way I needed him to. He told me more than once that I was being dramatic, that plenty of women had difficult deliveries and moved on without turning it into a production. He compared me once to his own mother, who had raised 4 children through genuine hardship, he said, without ever once needing anyone to coddle her through it. I met that same mother only a handful of times, always at holidays. I remember her as a formal, guarded woman who rarely spoke about her own life in any detail. I could later compare honestly against her son's version of it. That kitchen had pale yellow walls, a color I chose myself early in the marriage, back when choosing paint colors together still felt like an ordinary, hopeful kind of decision. I remember the specific chair I was sitting in at our own kitchen table when he said this, a chair with a wobbly leg I had meant to fix for months and never quite got around to. He said this at our own kitchen table, and he said a version of it to his mother, on the phone, within my hearing. He described me as unstable, in a tone that made the word sound like a diagnosis he had personally settled on himself. I made a list once quietly, of every specialist within an hour's drive who treated postpartum conditions, printed it out, and left it on the kitchen counter where Garrison would see it. He moved it to a drawer without comment, and I found it there weeks later, still folded exactly the way I had left it. I asked him, repeatedly, over the following 2 years, to help me find a specialist who actually understood postpartum panic disorders. He told me, each time, that therapy was expensive, that I simply needed to try harder, that other mothers managed without any of this fuss. There were smaller warning signs, too, in that first year, that I have only made sense of much later. I would sometimes count exits in a room without realizing I was doing it, an old habit I never noticed forming. A therapist eventually pointed it out, years afterward, as a common feature of the exact condition I had been living with. There is something quite specific worth stopping to say honestly and plainly, right here, before this particular story moves any further along. Have you ever been told, plainly, that a real, documented medical condition was simply a personality flaw you needed to correct through effort alone? If that has happened to you in any part of your life, I would like to hear about it, so tell me in the comments below. I think this specific kind of dismissal deserves more honest conversation than it usually gets. Here is exactly what those long, quietly difficult years actually did to our entire marriage. I spent the next 5 years managing my own panic largely alone, reading everything I could find, developing my own fragile coping strategies, while Garrison continued describing my condition to anyone who would listen as simply my personality. The waiting room that day was painted a pale, deliberately cheerful yellow, decorated with cartoon animals meant to comfort children rather than their exhausted parents. I remember one specific afternoon when Reese was almost 4, sitting in the pediatrician's waiting room. My hands shook badly enough that I had to set my coffee down before I spilled it. A nurse noticed, kindly, and asked whether I was all right, and I told her automatically that I was just tired, the same answer I gave everyone by then, including myself. She looked at me for a long moment, the way people sometimes do when they suspect an answer is not quite true, but she did not push further, and I did not offer anything more either. Reese grew from a toddler into a watchful, quiet little boy during those years. He was old enough eventually to notice that his mother sometimes needed to leave a room suddenly. He was old enough, too, to notice that his father rolled his eyes when it happened, rather than asking what was wrong. Her office sat above a small dry cleaner, up a narrow staircase. I climbed every other week for the better part of a year. I always arrived slightly out of breath by the time I reached her door. I found my own therapist eventually, on my own, 6 months before I actually left. I paid for it quietly, out of a small savings account Garrison did not know I kept. She was the first person, in all those years, who used the actual clinical term for what I had been living with: postpartum panic disorder. She said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, that I cried in her office for the better part of an entire session. It was simply from finally hearing my own experience described accurately by someone qualified to describe it. I left when Reese was 8, not suddenly, but after months of quiet planning, I did not share with Garrison until the arrangements were already made. I want to be clear about something specific here, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I did not leave Reese. I left Garrison, specifically, and I structured our custody arrangement, through lawyers, to keep my relationship with my son as steady and present as I could possibly make it. I refused, though, all direct contact with the man, who had spent 5 years calling my medical condition a character defect. Reese and I built our own steady rhythm over the years that followed, alternating weekends, regular calls, an entire structure of contact that ran independently of Garrison. It was coordinated instead through a co-parenting app neither of us needed to speak through directly. Her hands, I remember, always smelled faintly of yeast, even years after she had stopped baking regularly. It is a scent I associate with safety, more than almost anything else from my own childhood. I named the bakery after her, a woman who had taught me to bake bread as a child, standing on a kitchen stool in her small apartment, long before panic or marriage or any of what came later. I opened my bakery 2 years after moving, in a narrow storefront that had previously housed a failed sandwich shop, using a small business loan and every dollar of savings I had managed to protect during the marriage. I hired my first employee that same year, a retired baker named Osric who taught me more about laminated dough in 6 months than I had learned in years of teaching myself from books. The first year was terrifying in its own specific way, entirely unrelated to panic attacks. It was simply the ordinary terror of any new business owner, watching a bank account shrink faster than revenue could replace it. I slowly built a life, though, that felt, for the first time since Reese's birth, like it actually belonged to me. I did not speak to Garrison directly, not once in 7 full years, not at graduations, not at birthday parties, not at any of the ordinary milestones parents typically share. He wore the same faded green apron every time I saw him afterward, over years of small purchases, and he never once asked why a woman and a young boy had moved in alone above his shop. The store's owner, an older man who ran the register most afternoons, asked whether I was settling in all right, and I remember being surprised by how much that small, ordinary kindness meant to me that particular week. I remember standing in that same hardware store once, buying a simple lock for the bathroom door, and feeling an odd, quiet pride in choosing it entirely myself, a small decision nobody else needed to approve first. Dagny helped me find my first apartment, 40 minutes across the city, a small one-bedroom above a hardware store. It smelled faintly of sawdust, no matter how many candles I lit. She drove 2 carloads of boxes over herself, on a Saturday, without ever once asking me to explain more than I was ready to explain that particular week. I remember sitting on the floor of that empty apartment that first night, Reese asleep on a mattress in the corner. I felt something I had not felt in years, a specific, quiet safety that had nothing to do with anyone else's permission. I want to tell you about the specific quality of that particular silence, because I think it explains something about what came afterward. It was not bitter, most days, not the way people sometimes assume estrangement has to be. It was simply structural, a boundary I had built carefully and maintained without much daily effort, the way you maintain any wall you built for good reasons and have long since stopped resenting. One photograph in particular stood out among them, a picture of Reese as an infant, held by both of us together, taken before any of the difficulty between his parents had fully begun. He kept a small collection of photographs on his own bedroom wall at my apartment, a habit I never once asked him to start, mixing pictures from both households together without any apparent hierarchy between them. Reese grew into a tall, thoughtful teenager during those years, splitting his time evenly between two households. He developed an easy fluency at navigating both, without ever seeming to carry resentment about either one. He mentioned his father occasionally, in ordinary terms, a school project Garrison had helped with, a car Garrison was teaching him to drive. He never once, in 7 years, asked me to explain why I refused to speak to his father directly, and I never volunteered the explanation, trusting that he would ask if he genuinely needed to know. I assumed, honestly, that it would remain exactly that way indefinitely, right up until the night my phone rang at 11:40, showing a number I had not seen calling me in 7 years. The contact photo attached to his name was an old one, taken years before everything fell apart. I had genuinely forgotten it was still there, until it lit up my screen that night. I remember staring at my own phone screen for a full second before answering, his name still saved under the same contact entry I had never bothered to delete, 7 years untouched. Garrison's voice, when I finally answered, sounded nothing like the voice I remembered arguing with across our old kitchen table. It was smaller, hoarser, moving too fast. He explained that Reese had been in a car accident, a friend driving, nobody's fault exactly, that Reese was stable but in the emergency room at a hospital downtown, and that Reese had specifically, repeatedly, asked for me. I did not ask Garrison a single question about himself. I asked only what I needed to know to get to my son as quickly as possible, and I was in my car within 4 minutes of hanging up. The roads were nearly empty at that hour, streetlights blurring past in long orange streaks. The whole city held a specific late-night stillness I rarely noticed on ordinary days. My hands were steady on the wheel that entire drive, a detail I noticed only later, almost with surprise, given how badly they had shaken years earlier in that pediatrician's waiting room. I honestly do not know exactly when that particular tremor stopped controlling me, only that somewhere in the years of therapy and distance and rebuilding, it simply had, quietly, without my ever noticing the exact moment. I honestly suspect quite a few of you, reading this right now, have lived through some similar version of this exact situation yourselves. A call arrives from someone you had carefully stopped speaking to, breaking years of silence over an emergency neither of you chose. Has a call like that ever arrived in your own life, collapsing years of careful distance in a single ordinary evening? I would like to know, so leave a comment below and tell me. A forced reunion like that changes something in a person that a planned one never quite manages. Now, let me tell you what actually happened once I reached that hospital. Reese was already stable by the time I arrived, a fractured wrist and a concussion, serious enough to require overnight observation. It was not serious enough to threaten his life, a fact the nurse repeated to me twice before I fully absorbed it. I found him in a curtained bay, pale and a little tearful. The relief of seeing his face awake and recognizing me undid something in my chest that I had been holding tightly since the phone rang. He reached for my hand immediately, the same way he used to reach for it as a small boy, before either of us understood how complicated our own family history would eventually become. Garrison was standing near the foot of the bed, and for the first time in 7 years, I was standing in the same room with him. A monitor beside the bed beeped steadily, tracking Reese's heart rate, in a rhythm I found myself unconsciously matching my own breathing to over those first tense minutes. The bay itself smelled faintly of antiseptic, the curtain pulled halfway around us, giving the small space a strange, temporary privacy in the middle of an otherwise busy ward. A nurse moved between us efficiently, checking Reese's vitals, explaining the concussion protocol in the practiced, patient voice of someone who explained it several times every shift. Garrison asked her 2 clarifying questions, careful and specific, the kind of questions a genuinely attentive parent asks. I noticed, almost against my will, that this was not the man who used to leave every medical appointment to me during our marriage, treating doctors' visits as somehow beneath his attention. Something had shifted in him, in ways I could not yet fully account for, standing there in that curtained bay with my heart still pounding from the drive. The volume had been muted entirely, leaving only the flicker itself. It felt like a small mercy in an otherwise sterile room, one neither of us thought to mention aloud. A cartoon played silently on a small television mounted near the ceiling, its light flickering across Reese's pale face whenever he stirred. Reese drifted in and out of a light, medicated sleep over the following hour, waking occasionally to ask a confused question about his friend who had been driving, reassured each time that the friend was fine, shaken but unhurt. Someone had left a folded newspaper on the small side table between them, the crossword half finished in blue pen, in handwriting neither of us recognized. It was an oddly ordinary detail I noticed and could not quite stop noticing. Both chairs had the same worn armrests, the same slightly uneven legs that rocked faintly on the tile floor whenever either of us shifted our weight. I sat in a plastic chair on one side of the bed, and Garrison sat in a matching chair on the other. For a long stretch, neither of us spoke at all, simply watching our son sleep, in the specific, silent partnership that parents sometimes fall into automatically, regardless of what stands unresolved between them. I did not look at Garrison directly for several minutes, focusing entirely on Reese, on the details of his injuries, on the specific reassurance he seemed to need most. When I finally did look at Garrison, I noticed, almost against my will, how much older he looked than the man I remembered. Gray threaded through hair that had been solidly brown, and a heaviness sat around his eyes that had nothing to do with the late hour alone. He asked, quietly, whether we could speak in the hallway for a moment, and I agreed, mostly because Reese had drifted into an exhausted, medicated sleep and no longer needed either of us standing over him. A faint smell of antiseptic hung over that particular stretch of hallway, mixed oddly with something sweeter, coffee perhaps, drifting from a break room somewhere out of sight. Fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly overhead, the specific unflattering hospital light that makes everyone look slightly ill regardless of their actual condition. A vending machine hummed at the far end of that hallway, the only sound besides the distant beeping of monitors from other rooms. Garrison leaned against the wall opposite me, his hands jammed into his pockets, looking, for a moment, exactly as uncertain as he must have felt. In the hallway, Garrison thanked me for coming so quickly. Then, haltingly, he apologized for calling me directly, instead of routing everything through the co-parenting app the way we always had. He said he had not been thinking clearly, that Reese had asked for me by name, specifically, in a way that made routing the request through an app feel absurd. I told him I understood, and I meant it. I genuinely appreciated, too, how carefully and consistently he had actually respected that particular boundary over the many years since I left. Reese woke again around 1 in the morning, asking groggily whether someone could check his father's phone. He wanted a text from the orthopedic specialist, confirming a follow-up appointment time neither of us had written down. Garrison had stepped out to speak with a nurse at the desk. Reese, still groggy, simply handed me the phone himself, asking me to look, since his own hands were bandaged and clumsy from the IV line taped across them. The hallway around me seemed to go quiet in a specific way, the ordinary hospital noise fading into something distant and unimportant. I stood there holding a phone that was not mine, reading words I had genuinely never expected to exist. I want to describe exactly what I actually found, because this specific detail matters more than almost anything else I could possibly tell you. The specialist's text was there, easy enough to find. The phone's lock screen also displayed a Notes app notification, a reminder Garrison had apparently set for himself, titled simply, in his own words, an apology I still owe her. I should not have opened it. I understand that, and I want to be honest about the fact that I opened it anyway, standing in that hallway with my son's father's phone in my hand. 7 years of careful silence suddenly feeling very thin indeed. The note, dated 18 months earlier, described a therapy session Garrison had attended, one of what turned out to be dozens over the previous 3 years, sessions he had apparently never mentioned to a single member of his own family. In it, he had written, plainly, that his therapist had spent months helping him understand postpartum panic disorders, actual documented conditions he had spent 5 years of our marriage dismissing as simply my personality. He had written that he now understood I had been managing something genuinely dangerous, largely alone. He had called it dramatic, loudly enough for his own mother, to repeat the word at family gatherings for years afterward. I sat down on a hallway bench, reading that note twice, then a third time, absorbing something I had genuinely not expected to absorb that particular night. The note continued for several more paragraphs, describing specific sessions, specific realizations, a slow, unglamorous accumulation of understanding that clearly had not arrived all at once. He had written about a session where his therapist asked him to describe, in detail, exactly what my panic attacks had looked like from the outside. He had struggled, apparently, to answer honestly, since he realized he had spent years actively avoiding looking closely enough to remember. Garrison had spent 3 years, privately and without any audience to perform contrition for, actually reckoning with what he had done to me. He had never once mentioned any of this directly, not to Reese, not to me, not, as far as the note suggested, To anyone beyond a therapist's office, he apparently still visited every other week. The final paragraph of that particular note, dated only a week earlier, mentioned that he had finally felt ready to reach out. He had not yet decided how, or when, or whether Reese's own life would ever hand him a genuine, unforced opportunity to try. Here is a question that genuinely matters, I think, well beyond just my own particular situation here. Have you ever discovered that someone had been quietly doing the hard, unglamorous work of changing without ever once asking for credit for it? I would genuinely like to know, so leave your own story in the comments below. That particular kind of discovery complicates a story in ways a simple apology never quite manages. Let me tell you what happened when Garrison came back and found me holding his phone. He saw immediately what I was looking at, and his face went through several distinct stages: embarrassment first, then something closer to relief, the specific relief of a secret finally landing somewhere it could actually matter. He did not ask for the phone back right away. He simply sat down on the bench beside me, at a careful distance, and asked how much I had read. His voice, asking that question, carried none of the defensiveness I might have expected had I imagined this exact scenario at any point during the previous 7 years. It sounded instead like a man bracing for a verdict, one he had already privately decided he deserved, whatever that verdict turned out to be. The bench itself was cold under me, standard hospital furniture bolted firmly to the wall, and I remember focusing on that specific discomfort, briefly, as a way of staying grounded through the rest of the conversation. My own voice, answering him, sounded steadier than I expected, given how badly my hands had once shaken in that same specific kind of confrontation, years earlier. I told him honestly, plainly, all of it, 3 separate times through, without leaving anything out. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the hospital floor tiles. Then he said that he had always assumed he would tell me eventually, once he felt he had actually earned the right to say it out loud. That felt different, he said, than simply announcing an intention to change and asking me to trust it in advance. I asked him why 3 years of therapy had never once turned into an actual conversation, given how much time had passed. The bathroom in that memory still had the same peeling wallpaper we had meant to replace for years. He mentioned it almost apologetically, as though the wallpaper itself somehow mattered to the larger story. He described one specific memory from our marriage, a Christmas morning when I had a panic attack in the bathroom, while his entire family waited downstairs for gifts. He had told them cheerfully that I was simply taking my time getting ready. He said he thought about that particular morning often now, ashamed less of the lie itself than of how easily it had come to him at the time. He said, honestly, that he was afraid an apology delivered too early would sound exactly like the same performance he used to give me at our old kitchen table. He wanted, this time, to actually mean it before he ever said it. A cart rattled past us in the hallway, some late-night restocking run, and we both paused instinctively until the sound faded again into the general hum of the ward. I asked him, as steadily as I could manage, what specifically he understood now that he had not understood then. He said he understood that fear, which arrives in your body without warning, is not a character flaw to be argued out of someone. He said he understood that dismissing a documented medical condition repeatedly to a person's face and then to their entire family constitutes its own particular kind of harm, one that compounds every single time it happens. He said his therapist had used the word erosion, describing what 5 years of that specific dismissal actually does to a person's own trust in their own body. That word had stayed with him, he said, ever since he first heard it. He said he understood, finally, why I had needed to leave. Understanding it now, 3 years into genuinely working on himself, felt considerably more useful than understanding it might have felt, had I simply explained it to him back when I was still trying. I want to pause here again, briefly, because I think this next part deserves its own space, rather than getting folded into everything else happening in that hallway. Sitting there, on that hallway bench, I felt something I had not expected to feel that particular night, a strange, unwelcome flicker of grief for the marriage itself. It was not grief for what it had actually been, but for what it might have become had this exact understanding arrived 7 years earlier instead of now. I let that grief pass through me without acting on it, the way I had learned to let most difficult feelings pass. I understood, still, that Garrison's growth, real as it appeared to be, did not erase the 5 years I had spent managing a genuine medical crisis, while being told it was simply my personality. It did, though, complicate the version of him I had carried in my head for 7 years, the version who had never once considered that he might have been wrong. Garrison asked, quietly, whether I would consider letting him actually apologize properly, not through a note meant only for himself, but directly, whenever I felt ready to hear it. I told him I needed time to think about what I wanted that conversation to actually look like. He said he understood, that he had, after all, taken 3 years to work up to writing himself a note he had not even managed to act on yet. I called Dagny from the hospital parking garage that same morning, before the sun fully rose, and told her everything: the accident, the note, the locket I did not yet know existed. She went quiet for a while, listening on her end, then asked, carefully, how I actually felt, rather than how I thought I should feel about all of it. I told her I genuinely did not know yet, and she said that was, in her experience, usually the most honest answer available right after something like this happens. Reese was discharged the following afternoon, his wrist set, his concussion monitored, cleared to recover at home with follow-up visits scheduled. I drove him back to Garrison's house myself, since my own apartment was considerably farther from his school. I stayed for a cup of coffee at Garrison's kitchen table, the first time I had sat in that specific kitchen in 7 years. It looked different, repainted, reorganized, though the window over the sink still faced the same maple tree it always had. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator, one of Reese's from years earlier, faded now. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, clearly meant to represent our small family, whole and uncomplicated, the way he understood it at 5 years old. I felt a small pang seeing it there, evidence that Garrison had kept small pieces of our shared history around him, this entire time, quietly, without ever mentioning it. Garrison and I spoke honestly for almost an hour that afternoon, while Reese slept upstairs. We caught up on nothing in particular, mostly just establishing what an honest conversation between us could actually sound like, after 7 years of having none at all. He told me, at one point, that he had kept a small gold locket of mine, one I had left behind in the rush of packing 7 years earlier. It was a gift from my own mother, one I had genuinely mourned losing. He retrieved it from a drawer in the hallway, still carefully wrapped in the same cloth pouch I remembered. He handed it to me without any particular ceremony, simply saying he had always meant to mail it and had somehow never managed to. I noticed the drawer itself, briefly, before he closed it again. It was a shallow catch-all drawer, the exact kind every kitchen seems to accumulate mismatched keys and old batteries, and apparently one small piece of my own history he had quietly protected. The gold itself had dulled slightly with age, a soft, worn patina replacing the brighter shine I remembered from years earlier, though the small engraved initials on its back were still perfectly legible. The clasp still worked, a small detail I checked almost automatically. Opening it, I found the tiny photograph inside, exactly where I remembered leaving it, a picture of my own mother, taken decades earlier. She was smiling in a way I rarely saw her smile in any other photograph from that period of her life. I held that locket in my palm for a long moment, turning it over, surprised by how much its return affected me, given everything else that had happened in the previous 24 hours. He had moved most of his own belongings into storage that same year. He mentioned, in a smaller apartment across town, before eventually buying back into the house we once shared together. He described that smaller apartment as the loneliest place he had ever lived, 4 bare walls and a mattress on the floor for the first several months. He described that particular year plainly, a difficult stretch when his own anger had briefly overtaken whatever quiet guilt was already forming underneath it. Garrison said, quietly, that he had almost thrown it away once, in an angry moment about a year after I left. Not throwing it away, he said, was, in its own small way, the first genuinely different choice he remembered making, back before therapy, before the note, before any of the rest of it. He told me he had kept it in the same drawer ever since, moving it carefully whenever he reorganized that particular room, never quite able to explain to himself why he bothered. Dagny came by the bakery the following Sunday, our usual quiet morning together before opening, and listened to the entire story again, slower this time, asking careful questions I had not yet fully answered even for myself. Dagny had, in fact, offered once, quietly, during the worst stretch of my marriage, to let me and Reese move in with her immediately, no explanation required, an offer I never took her up on but never forgot either. She had never liked Garrison much, during the marriage, though she had always been too kind to say so directly, limiting herself instead to carefully neutral comments that, in hindsight, communicated her actual opinion perfectly well. I could see her working now, to hold 2 things at once, her old protective anger on my behalf, and a genuine, cautious curiosity about the man he apparently was becoming. Dagny, my younger sister who lives 2 streets from my bakery, asked me that same week whether I planned to forgive Garrison completely, now that I understood what those 3 years of therapy had actually involved. I explained, as plainly as I could, that forgiveness was not really the question I was asking myself. The real, harder question was whether an honest, ongoing relationship, built slowly and without any illusions about the past, was possible between us now, for Reese's sake and, perhaps, eventually, for my own. Dagny asked, gently, whether I thought I could ever trust him again in any meaningful sense. I explained, carefully, that trust was simply not actually the right word, honestly, for whatever I was still slowly rebuilding. It felt closer to observation, watching consistently over time, whether his actions matched his words. It was the same patient method I used at the bakery whenever I trained a new hire I could not yet fully vouch for. I have seen Garrison several times since that night at the hospital, always briefly, always around logistics involving Reese. The conversations themselves, though, have shifted into something considerably more honest. They are nothing like the rooted messages we exchanged for 7 years, through an app neither of us had to speak through. The drawing itself was a simple cartoon of a lighthouse, oddly specific. Garrison explained afterward that it was a private joke between them, about a family trip Reese barely remembered taking as a toddler. He wore that cast for exactly 6 weeks, decorating it eventually with signatures from his friends, and near the very end, a small careful drawing from his father that Reese showed me proudly, unprompted, over video call one evening. Reese's wrist healed cleanly over the following 6 weeks, the cast finally coming off in early spring. He returned to his ordinary teenage routines, with the specific resilience only teenagers seem to manage after a genuine scare. He mentioned, once, almost in passing, that he had noticed his parents talking more, that dinners at his father's house sometimes included a phone call from me now, brief and ordinary, about nothing more significant than his week. He did not ask why. I think, in his own quiet way, he had simply been waiting for it. Children sometimes wait patiently. For things they never quite believed, they were allowed to ask for directly. He asked me, last week, whether I would consider joining one of his therapy sessions eventually. Not to reconcile romantically, he was careful to clarify, but so that Reese could eventually see both of us handling this history honestly, together, in front of him. That felt better, he said, than the careful silence Reese had grown up quietly navigating around. I asked him, when he raised the idea, why he thought it mattered so specifically that I be the one present, rather than simply continuing his own individual work. He said he wanted Reese to see that healing did not require pretending nothing had happened, that 2 people could sit honestly in the same room with a difficult history, without either performing forgiveness they did not fully feel yet. I have not yet decided whether I will say yes to that particular request. A framed diploma still hangs slightly crooked on the wall behind her desk, a small imperfection I have noticed and never once mentioned, across years of appointments in that same familiar room. A small potted plant sits on her windowsill now, new since my last visit, thriving despite what looked like genuine neglect in its slightly yellowed lower leaves. I found myself, oddly, comforted by that particular imperfection, a living thing surviving reasonably well despite less than ideal conditions. It felt like a fitting enough metaphor for the actual work I was there to do. My therapist's office looks almost exactly as I remembered it, the same worn armchair, the same box of tissues placed within easy reach on the side table. I have started, this month, seeing my own therapist again, not out of crisis this time. I simply want to approach whatever comes next, with the same clear-headed intention I have tried to bring to everything else since I left. She asked me, in our first session back, what I was actually afraid of regarding Garrison's continued presence in my life. I surprised myself, answering honestly, that I was afraid of becoming, once again, someone who explained away things that deserved a clearer name. I know that whatever I decide, it will not be decided quickly. It will not be decided, either, out of obligation to whatever tidy version of reconciliation outside observers might prefer for a story shaped like mine. I know only that the woman who left 7 years ago, exhausted and unbelieved, would not recognize how calmly I can now sit across a kitchen table from Garrison Brennan. I ask him honest questions now and expect honest answers in return. Here is what 7 years of silence and one broken phone call actually taught me, and these are lessons I want to leave with you clearly, exactly as I promised at the start of this story. A documented medical condition is never a character flaw, no matter how convenient it might be for someone else to describe it that way. I spent 5 years second guessing my own body, wondering whether I was simply weak. It took a single professional, finally, to use the correct clinical language for what I had actually been experiencing the entire time. I spent 5 years being told that a genuine panic disorder was simply my personality. I understand now that the confidence with which Garrison dismissed it said considerably more about his own limitations than it ever said about the reality of what I was actually experiencing. I remember the specific relief I felt, signing that custody agreement with my own lawyer present. I understood, for the first time in years, that a legal document could actually protect the exact distinction I needed most: my son without my husband. Leaving a marriage does not require leaving your child. A boundary drawn carefully, with real structure behind it, can protect a relationship with your child, precisely by removing the person who made that relationship harder to sustain. I left Garrison, specifically, 7 years ago, and I have never once regretted the distinction. I think about Reese often, in relation to this particular lesson. He is currently at exactly the age where he is learning what change actually looks like, watching both of his parents up close. I hope, more than almost anything else, that he learns something specific from this chapter of our family's history. Real change is measured in years and small actions, not in a single dramatic gesture meant to resolve everything at once. I have started, this past year, mentoring a young mother at my own bakery who mentioned, once, in an offhand comment, that she sometimes felt her own postpartum anxiety was simply exaggeration. I recognized the specific shape of that sentence immediately. I told her, as gently as I could, exactly what I wished someone had told me at her age: that her fear deserved a real name and real treatment, not a private apology for feeling it at all. Real change, when it happens, often happens quietly, without an audience, long before it ever becomes visible to the person who was actually harmed. Garrison spent 3 years working on himself before I ever knew any of it was happening. I understand now that the absence of a performance does not necessarily mean the absence of real effort. Discovering that someone has changed does not erase the years before they changed, but it can complicate a story that might otherwise have stayed simple, and I have learned that complication is not always something to resist. I do not owe Garrison forgiveness on any particular schedule, but I also no longer feel obligated to pretend his growth does not exist, simply because acknowledging it complicates a narrative I once found easier to hold on to. The coffee shop we favored for these conversations sat 2 blocks from my own bakery, small and quiet enough most mornings that we could talk freely without worrying about being overheard by regular customers. I told Dagny this exact thing over coffee one morning. She admitted she had been quietly hoping I would eventually arrive at some cleaner, more satisfying version of the story, one where Garrison simply remained the villain and I remained entirely unmoved. She said she was glad, though, watching me talk through it, that real life rarely offers anyone that particular convenience. An imperfect, honestly rebuilt relationship, built slowly and without illusions, can still be worth more than either a clean, permanent break or a rushed, premature reconciliation. I used to believe those were the only 2 honest options available to anyone in my exact position. Walk away completely, or forgive completely, with nothing genuine occupying the space between them. I understand now that the space between them is actually where most real relationships eventually live, messy and ongoing and never quite finished, which is precisely what makes them real. I do not know exactly what Garrison and I will become to each other over the years still ahead of us. I know it will be built, though, the same way his 3 years of quiet therapy were built, slowly, honestly, and without any expectation of credit along the way. If any part of this particular story reached you, here is something specific worth honestly considering, something that has nothing to do with hospitals or marriages at all. Think about a boundary you built for good reasons, one you have maintained so consistently that you nearly forgot why it existed in the first place. Share your own version in the comments, and consider asking yourself, honestly, whether that boundary still serves the purpose it was originally built for, or whether it has simply become a habit you have not examined in years. I do not offer that question lightly, since I know some boundaries genuinely do need to remain exactly as fixed as the day you built them, regardless of any apparent change on the other side. I only ask because mine, at least, deserved a second look, and I would have missed that fact entirely had an ordinary car accident not forced the question on me directly. I did not examine mine, honestly, for most of those 7 years, simply trusting that the original reasons still held, without ever revisiting whether Garrison himself had changed enough to warrant reconsidering it. I understand now that a boundary can be entirely correct when you build it, and still deserve, eventually, an honest second look, once enough time and evidence have actually accumulated. My bakery has grown enough this past year that I finally hired a full-time assistant manager, a young woman named Zaria who reminds me, in certain unguarded moments, of exactly who I was before Reese was born. She is confident and unafraid of her own body, in ways I am still slowly relearning for myself. I catch myself watching her sometimes, hoping quietly that she never has to learn the particular lesson I learned, the hard way, about which fears deserve to be believed. I still keep that gold locket on my dresser now, in the same cloth pouch Garrison returned it in. I have started wearing it again, though, on ordinary days, the way I did before Reese was born, before the panic, before 7 years of silence that both of us needed and neither of us fully chose. The ovens hummed steadily behind us that morning, the specific warm smell of proofing dough filling the small kitchen, the way it always did before opening. Flour dusted the counter between us that morning, fine white powder catching the early light, through the front window in a way that always struck me as oddly beautiful, given how ordinary the substance actually was. Zaria asked me once, noticing it at the bakery, whether it held any particular significance, and I found myself telling her a shortened version of this entire story, standing there in flour-dusted aprons between the ovens. She listened carefully, the way young people sometimes listen to older women when they sense a real lesson buried somewhere inside an ordinary object, and she thanked me afterwards, simply, for trusting her with it. I sometimes drive past that hospital, on my way to a supplier across town, and I feel almost nothing now, looking at its plain brick exterior, no longer the charged, singular location it briefly became that one particular Tuesday night. It has settled back into being simply a building, ordinary again, the way most locations eventually do. Once the specific event that marked them fades, they settle back into the wider shape of an ordinary life. I think about that specific hallway bench often, the exact weight of Garrison's phone in my hand, the note I was never supposed to read. It still feels strange, some quiet mornings, that the truth I needed most arrived entirely by accident, in a stranger's careful handwriting, meant only for himself, never once intended for my eyes at all. Reese asked me once, months later, whether I regretted looking at his father's phone that night. I answered truthfully that I did not regret it, not even slightly, that some accidents end up serving a genuine purpose, larger than the small rule they technically break. Neither of us, honestly, would have deliberately picked that particular painful route, given any real choice in the matter at all. I have come to believe, though, that some truths simply refuse to arrive on any schedule anyone actually chooses. They show up instead in the middle of an ordinary crisis, in the specific accidental moment when a person finally stops guarding them.